Hello, everyone. I am Sylvia Ariano Fernandez, and I am the guest curator for this exhibition entitled Andrew McIlvaine Resilient Story. Thank you for joining me in this opening. I am pleased to introduce my dear friend Andrew tonight, and I would love to thank Joanne Northrup, our wonderful, amazing executive director, Andrew Schell, who I'm pretty sure is the most invested person in this show, Martina, Jorge, Molly, Whitney, Catherine, Marion Matos, all who put their hard work into this exhibition and came together as a team. This exhibition is Andrew's first institutional solo show, and we are honored and thrilled to be showing it. Andrew McIlvaine is a Mexican-American interdisciplinary artist born in San Antonio, Texas. Raised in Missouri, Andrew creates work about the displacement and replacement of cultures stemming from settler colonialism. And how these issues affect both personal and collective memory, identity, and history. McIlvaine earned his BA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and his MFA from Washington University in St. Louis. In 2022, McIlvaine won the Visual Artist Award from the Charlotte Street Foundation. He currently lives in Overland Park, Kansas, and is an assistant professor at the Kansas City Art Institute. Following Andrew's presentation, we will have a question and answers, depending on how long he talks, because if you don't know him, he's a talker. So please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you all for coming today. I'm going to start off by getting first my presentation in order. Again, thank you all for joining me today at the NERMN. I'm so excited to be here with everyone. About 5 years ago, I moved back to Kansas City from St. Louis. And when I moved back, I ended up actually moving into a small apartment off of 135th and Quivira. Echoing. And that apartment complex is actually... No, you're fine. That apartment complex is actually, just a few miles away from where the NERMN is currently, right? So when I moved back, I moved to 135th and Quivira. And when I returned to this city, I didn't really know what I was returning to in many ways, and I didn't really know what I was in search of in many ways. But I knew that I was somehow kind of on the right path. I could feel deep down that I was making the right steps moving forward. And although I think in many ways I sacrificed a lot in order to come back to this city, when I came back, I was sort of unsure of that movement. I think that's also just because I was in graduate school for multiple years. I think that experience in many ways was very draining. And so when I came back, art was the last thing that was on my mind, to be honest. I think really the only thing that was on my mind when I returned to this city was this sort of impending feeling that I needed to find a job, I needed to somehow find a career, and I needed to somehow survive, right? And so in many ways, that's what I did. I came back to this city, I returned to my old job where I started serving tables and bartending. And I would do that in the sort of afternoon, and in the evening I would commute to my sort of evening job where I teach at a community college called MCC Penn Valley. And so I was working multiple jobs at that time, and most days I would start my day right around 6, and I would end usually right around 1, sometimes 2 a.m. in the morning. And the reason why I bring this up is because every night when I got off of work, my routine was to drive down 435 and get off at the Quivira exit. And I would drive down this road, and I would pass this museum. And I think in many ways that was really inspiring. With so much darkness going on around me at that time, passing by the museum was sort of this beacon of hope. It was, in many ways, the only thing that sort of felt like it illuminated the space. It sort of glowed in the dark. And so when I got home to my apartment, it wasn't the soreness in my knees, it wasn't the soreness in my hands, it wasn't the soreness in my feet or my back from working. It was really this museum. In many ways, that was the last thing on my mind. And just this idea that if I really applied myself, if I got back into making art, if I continued these narratives and continued working hard, that I could somehow make it into a great museum like this. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be here with everyone, and I feel super privileged to be in this space with everyone. No, I want to start off my talk by talking a little bit about resilience. Resilience is a term that speaks about one's capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties or struggles. The word itself communicates toughness through one's flexibility and one's wearability. Discussing resilience means discussing both adapting and reacting. Resilience can be emotional, it can be physical, and it can even be spiritual. Resilience is the ability to sustain one's sense of self and purpose through a set of beliefs, principles, or values that we kind of encounter throughout adversity, stress and trauma through internal and external factors, demands, and pressures. So resilience and Resilience Story is the title of my show tonight, but in many ways, resilience is what lies at the heart of my work. And so I realize that being in this space tonight, it's really resilience that made my family survive the projects. It's really what allowed us to get out of the projects. Resilience is how my dad made it out of prison. And despite the many hardships that my family has seen generation after generation, in many ways, I'm here on this stage with you all because of resilience and stories of resilience. And so I want to begin this lecture by discussing some of my previous work and the relationship my work has with my identity, as my work is always sort of an entanglement of influences, but really is sort of paying homage to previous generations. So as you'll see tonight, the work varies in aesthetic and it varies in design, and it even varies in arrangement. But the work is always reflective of stories that communicate notions regarding home, longing, loss, and past trials and tribulations. And these are always sort of connected to personal and collective histories that make up the South and Southwestern regions of the United States, as well as the Northern and Northwestern regions of Mexico. And that's really because that's where my family roots come from. Although I grew up a majority of my life in a small rural town in southern Missouri called Joplin, I'm from the Wheatley Quartz Projects. That's where my family's from, and the generations before them come from the borderlands. And so the work is always reflective and paying homage to the past and reflects the mythology and the folklore that's passed down from previous generations. These influences, again, all stem from generations of Chicanos, Tejanos, and Mexicans. Other subcultures, such as sports culture, custom culture, car culture, and even cattle culture come into play. You know, my genetic makeup and cultural heritage includes Mexican, Indigenous, and Spanish from my mother's side, Mexican, Indigenous, and Spanish and German from my dad's side. And so my work becomes a kind of an entanglement of these influences. And in the work, these things sort of coexist in the same spaces. They, in many ways, are shown as forces that are overlapping, blending, or mirroring each other, or things that are getting pressed together. So the work that I typically make comes in waves or chapters, like chapters in a book. Each previous chapter sort of informs the next, so my art, much like my life, becomes very cyclical in nature. It is constantly kind of connecting and reconnecting to the older parts, previous parts, as well as present parts. And so the past and the present in my work are always sort of infused together. Tonight you'll see some symbols and icons that frequent the work, such as the Nike swoosh, butterflies, Guadalupe, chains, roses, horses, and elements like water, earth, air, and fire. The work, again, in many ways is a way for me to fill in the cracks that make up my family history. So, you know, my family's filled with a lot of loss, it's filled with a lot of movement, it's filled with a lot of struggle, it's filled with a lot of oppression. And because of that, I think that there are a lot of fragmented parts in my family. There are a lot of pieces. And so as an artist and as a creator, what I'm, I think, often trying to do or striving to do is take these fragments and collage them together, fuse them together in order to sort of find this larger image, discover what this larger image means, and try to find some sort of reconciliation within those images. And so I want to start off with chapter 1. And this work will kind of walk you chronologically from some of the earlier work up until the present work and the work that's sort of shown outside in the gallery. So chapter 1 is about water. I want to start off with a couple of the images from chapter 1, a body of work that I titled Movement. And movement is really about my great-grandparents and my grandparents' generational movement from northern Mexico to southern Texas. And it is sort of inspired by the subsequent translation and transformation that occurs through that assimilation. So the work is also inspired by several movements, the main movement becoming Chicano movement. And again, this is a connection to my sort of family history. So one movement specifically that becomes influential for the work is this movement called La Onda, which means the wave. And this is a multidisciplinary artistic movement that goes into music. You see it in literature, you see it in cinema, you see it in politics, and you even see it in spirituality. Although La Onda means the wave, it can also be interpreted as meaning ripple, as it is a movement that sort of originates in Mexico and washes into the southern parts of the United States. And it really becomes something that gets entangled within the South and Southwestern United States, specifically within counterculture and civil rights activists. And so these things are, again, things that I'm kind of connecting to my origin and my place of origin, which is San Antonio, but also, again, my family's origins in terms of the borderlands. And so another influence that becomes a big part of the work is this word called Olin, or Olin. It is a term derived from the Nahuatl word Yayotl, or Yayot, meaning heart. Olin has several interpretations, including motion, movement, for, and the path of life. And Olin is a central life force. It speaks about the cyclical nature of life and its frequent movement found within it. So it talks about sort of day to day, year to year, and generation to generation. You know, another reason why I wanted to start with this work is because it deals with water, which is one of the main life forces that we come in contact in our lives. Water symbolizes life, it symbolizes purification, it symbolizes hope, it symbolizes growth, and it symbolizes birth, as we're all born from water. Water is also very reflective as a material, and it absorbs its surroundings like a mirror, reflecting the history of the spaces it accumulates as well as nurtures. So here you see two images from this movement, from this body of work. The left is titled Hora, or hour in Spanish. Also, you could see it as time. And it is a ripple frozen in time. This image captures a collision, both its inward and outward force. And the work, much like the images up here, oftentimes become quite ambiguous in terms of their placement. You know, they don't necessarily place them in one area or one environment. The context or the background is at times very vague. So at times you can place it in certain spaces, but other times it becomes quite ambiguous in terms of its arrangement. But this painting sort of symbolizes the start of a movement, a ripple that would ultimately build to a wave that would ultimately wash into the future. And much like this idea of a wave, there's this sort of other idea that's connected to this, which is sort of this butterfly effect. How one thing in one generation can ripple outwards and affect the generations to come. And so these things are always at play within the work. And within this idea, you get both the micro and the macro. You get these zoomed in perspectives as well as the zooming out of perspectives. And this is really just to see the collision and the aftermath of that collision, and these things sort of grow in scale, they grow in effect. You know, I typically connect this idea of collision in my work to settlers' colonialism, or the displacement and replacement of cultures and cultural belief systems due to conquest. So the work in many ways also analyzes pre-Columbian life and post-Columbian life. It looks at indigenous life and its relationship to European life, in addition to its sort of movement to America, and again, this sort of Anglo life found within those spaces. Images in this series come from all over. You have personal images that come into play, historical and cultural images get absorbed into the work, Even contemporary images from popular culture get absorbed into the work, much like the image on the right, which is titled Flotador, which means to float. This image was sourced from many sort of media sources and outlets that continuously sort of perpetuate these sort of stereotypes that aim at dehumanizing individuals seeking asylum and refuge within a country. And I think for me, I was connecting that to my family and their migration from Mexico to the United States. And I was also looking at, in many ways, how popular culture depicts my culture. I think growing up in America, the only time I often see my culture being representative is through a sort of negative lens. And I think that in many ways that sort of affects us psychologically. It becomes very hard to, at times, be proud of that culture when you have so many outward forces that are telling you that these are negative qualities. And so I think growing up and being attached to these histories, there was a sense of sort of blueness, there was a sense of sort of depression, there was a sense of sadness, and there was at times this sense of ashamed that was attached to this history. And so this negative lens or negative filter that's laid over the work is a way of sort of inverting the images, turning the areas that are typically dark, light. And so the figures here, which are typically, very silhouetted, start to glow. They start to get absorbed by light. And this sort of is an effect that washes into the rest of the work as well within this series. This idea of self-reflection has become a big part of my conceptual framework in my practice. So there are always images displayed in pairs and works that are reflective in their surface quality. And so you have a lot of surfaces within the work that are reflective and they absorb shadows and lights. And you also have works like this one that have physical mirrors attached to them and embedded into them. And so these two sculptures, the left and the middle image is actually the same image. You just see in the front and the back of the same sculpture. And the right image is a separate sculpture. The left sculpture is titled Llaron, and the sculpture on the right is titled Llarona. And that means weeping in Spanish. And so you see the left sculpture is carrying this mirror on its back, this reflection of the past in many ways. The sculpture on the right is carrying this mirror that is reflecting the present as well as reflecting the future as it is attached to the front of the figure. And both of these figures sort of wander around this space. At times they're reflecting and capturing reflections of the work that exists on the wall. And at times they're also reflecting each other, as you can kind of see in the center image there, where they start to absorb each other and become reflective of each other. These images are representative of a lot of things. They become influential in terms of, previous cultures. A lot of Mexica influences come into the work. And so these things are things that I'm referencing based on pre-Columbian life and, again, also post-Columbian life. And so you see these sort of votive figures that are standing in this space reflecting, the present as well as the past as well as the future, absorbing all of these histories together. But you also see that the figures are sort of covered in white acrylic. They have this sort of white acrylic skin to them. And the sculptures are made out of terracotta, so they have this sort of rich, sort of orange or burnt orange color when they get fired. And I was kind of covering that sort of redness and that orangeness with this sort of whitewash. And this whitewash was sort of a reflection of how I was feeling within society. I was also feeling as if, in many ways, I was losing sight of my history, as if I didn't know a lot about my history. I didn't know my personal history. I, at times, didn't know my cultural heritage. And so the work sort of becomes a reflection of those elements. And it becomes sort of a reflection of the sadness felt within that feeling. And so both figures stand in this space, very quiet, very still, but both of them also have teardrops that are sort of falling from their eyes. And so they kind of quietly weep in the space as you sort of walk around them. This chapter of water would ultimately give way to a new chapter of life, a chapter about earth and a chapter about growth. So we're going to move from this sort of monochromatic color scheme, which is made from titanium white and cobalt blue, a common tile color and ceramic color found in Mexico and the south and southwestern regions of the United States, as well as the Greyhound bus station in San Antonio. And so we're going to move to a new color palette, and we're going to move to a new chapter, one that's filled with warmth, one that's filled with love, and one that references and is reflective of poetry. And so we move into this body of work, this chapter. In this chapter, again, the last chapter was water. This chapter is earth. And so chapter 2 deals with earth. It deals with the solid poetry that is based upon my family's movement from the Wheatley Courts projects to a small rural town in southern Missouri called Joplin. And this work talks about healing generational trauma. It talks about healing trauma through the physical, the spiritual, and the sort of ceremonial engagement with earth, nature, light, plants, and the wisdom that is sort of nurtured from previous generations, specifically this sort of nurturing that is found within visual and literal poetry within my family. I also want to mention Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera, Octavio Paz, Piedra del Sol or Sunstone, and Labyrinth of Solitude, as well as Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. These all become sort of influential books that very much inspired how I thought about the narrative of this work and influenced the way that I sort of depicted the work in its arrangement. So for this body of work, I wanted to sort of talk about my relationship with my father and my mother and the relationship the two had together while living in the courts. As I already said, again, I'm from a small project called Wheatley Courts, located on the east side of SA or San Antonio. I grew up in Section 8. I grew up in welfare. I grew up in food stamps. My mom made roughly $1,400 a year in the courts. And so both parents saw a lot of adversity. Both lost friends. They lost loved ones. My dad, was on the streets, and so he was constantly in and out of the court system most of his life. And when I was about a few years old, he ended up catching a case that would place him in federal prison for a large chunk of my life. And so the work kind of became about this communication that's exchanged through images, not necessarily through spoken word. Having a father in prison, most of my communication was written in letters and found in images exchanged through the mail. And within that relationship, there are also significant gaps of no communication. And so that experience in many ways sort of shaped the way that I saw things at a young age, because I think although that was a difficult position to be in as a kid, it made me realize the privilege of these sort of small things, like having family around, having a father, being able to even hear my father's voice for the first time, which doesn't happen until I'm about 12 years old. And so it kind of gave me this sort of higher perspective of life in many ways. And I learned a lot of wisdom through him and the things that he went through and saw, and things that he's sort of still dealing with at times. And so this was the first time I started drawing on paño, or fabric in Spanish. This was really a result of reconnecting with my dad. So still, when I draw on fabric, there's this tremendous sense that my dad's in the room. Every time I touch pen to fabric, again, it's just this feeling that my dad's present. And so it's something that I do kind of ritualistically to engage with him, even when he's not in the space. So these two paños sort of open up the show, Solid Poetry. The left is titled Solid Poetry, and the right is titled My Storm, My Garden, My Dream. And this paño illustrates my origin story in many ways. And so you can read this sort of like a roadmap. The image starts with images of Mickey Mouse, which made up most of my images of my first paños I received as a kid. And so I was talking to a few individuals about this, which is, I grew up with seeing images of Mickey Mouse that my dad drew and sent me to prison. I grew up super poor, so I didn't have Disney, I didn't have cable. So when I used to see Mickey Mouse out in life, I used to think that it was my dad. Yeah, I used to think that he was the inventor of Mickey Mouse. And so, in many ways, I used to think that, that was the connection to Disney. And so it created this sort of magical, realistic perspective in many ways. But despite Mickey typically being shown as happy-go-lucky, which is usually how he's shown in my paños, Mickey is shown here exhausted. He's shown here worn out. He's shown here tired and crying. These tears flow into the images below, raining onto symbols like the Nike swoosh. Smoke from this joint rolls out and gets entangled into the calligraphy that welcomes us into the scene. You also have images of Guadalupe that show up on the necklace that exists right underneath the Nike swoosh. This is an image that shows up on this paño because the first thing that I was given as a gift from my dad when I was born was a gold chain, and it was a gold Guadalupe necklace. And in many ways, he says that this was a gift that was given to me as a way of protecting me in the Wheatley courts. It was sort of a guardian angel that I wore around my neck. And so I sort of pay homage to these things, these images within this particular work. On the bottom left, you see this sort of symbol that looks like a staircase that washes into a wave. And this is a common motif in Mexico, specifically within the complexes of Mexico and pyramids. And this is referred to often as a step fret. And it symbolizes a lot of things. It symbolizes waves, it symbolizes water, it symbolizes movement. It can also be connected to the conch shell and transformation. And so you see this sort of motif that breaks up and starts to transform, and it leads into the bottom left corner. Here you see an image of a greyhound, which is sort of the same symbol and motif that you would see within a greyhound bus. And so you see it kind of come out of nowhere, breaking the sort of pictorial plane, running upwards into Joplin, which is this sort of symbol here. You have a sort of a broken heart. So the greyhound runs through Joplin, runs into Kansas City, where the star is. In addition to that image, you also have images of monarch butterflies that become prominent within the work. Monarch butterflies become important within the work because they symbolize generational movement. I'm not sure if many people know this, but monarchs migrate from southern Mexico, and they migrate into the United States through Texas, and ultimately will land in parts of Canada. It takes them 3 generations to make that movement. So the first generation that leaves Mexico won't be the generation that will ultimately find that home. 2 generations will pass after that generation until that being sort of finds its home, finds its purpose. Oftentimes what happens is it'll give birth to this sort of powerful generation that is able to make it all the way back to Mexico in 1 generation. So what it takes 3 generations to make it up to these places, it takes 1 generation to get back down to. And so this became a kind of common motif found within the work, and you'll see these things kind of transform further within the work as well. You also have symbols of the dandelion that exist here, the sort of cyclical cycle of that dandelion as it sort of blossoms from here to here to here, where then it starts to sort of explode and ripple outwards and turns into these stars. And that really became a symbol of resilience as well, one of the earlier symbols of resilience. And this is because dandelions symbolize rebirth, they symbolize growth, and they symbolize resilience because they can weather extreme frost as well as extreme heat. And so, again, they're very difficult blossoms to sort of kill. We move from that image to these images here. So you see these images sort of further transform from the 2-dimensional to the 3-dimensional in the work. You start to see actual butterflies come into play. You see these arrows. You see the work become more 3-dimensional in its arrangement. The title of this piece is called Sunshine Over Shallow Graves. It's a mixed media work that includes oil on canvas, Home Depot rulers, monarch butterflies, enamel, sand, pyrite, arrows, and candy paint. Candy paint is also a reference that stems from Chicano culture and car culture that's passed on to me from my father. So candy paint is typically the sort of sparkle finish that you'll see within lowriders. And so this becomes a kind of common motif within the work as well. And it's something that I also kind of connect to this sort of magical, realistic perspective. The central focus of this work becomes Guadalupe. she's displayed sort of center within the work. And she exists on top of, or stacked on top of, this sort of monument, this sort of silhouette of a pyramid that exists in the background. And so within the work, again, it's talking about this sort of stacking of history. Guadalupe comes into the work because my parents are deeply devotional. And I was raised Catholic. I was raised in a very religious and sort of spiritual environment. And that's something that's instilled in my generation pretty heavily. That comes into the Paños from my dad's work as well. And this is because, again, he's in prison, and so in many ways he's sort of repenting. And he's sort of revealing these things through me as a kid. These hopes and promises, these past guilts, these things that he's ashamed of. And these aren't things that are typically voiced in words. These are things that are typically voiced in images. And it's not things that I typically really realized until I got much older and was able to sort of step back from a different perspective and analyze the work. This also becomes representative of the gift that my dad gives me when I'm born. So like I said, the first thing that he gives me is a gold chain. A gold chain that has Guadalupe on it. And again, it's a chain that's given to me as a protector. This alongside milagros were given to me when I was a kid. So milagros are just Spanish for miracles. They're typically tin casted votive figures, small. They're like little charms. And they're given to loved ones for good luck. They're sort of devotional charms, in a sense. And so these things are sort of presented to me when I'm born. And these become very influential for the work as I kind of move forward. So this notion of religion and icons sort of made me think about multiple histories that exist in spaces. It made me realize that these sites aren't sites that are just one culture or made of one culture, but many cultures that are stacked on top of each other over time. Cultures that are deconstructed and reconstructed. And within that, they subsequently create new stories and new histories that are born from them. And so I'm really interested in illustrating these sort of collective histories through these narratives being told through these objects and materials. And this, in many ways, started to make me think about this sort of love and relationship between my mother and my father. And so, again, I think that in many ways they found each other in the courts because they were both devotional. They were both very religious. And they're both trying to find meaning in this chaos, And so I think within that relationship, they end up finding each other. And that sort of solidifies that relationship. And ultimately, that gives birth to my generation. But like I said, again, my father gets thrown away. And so I think that also led to my mom further going into religion, trying to find meaning, trying to find some sort of purpose in these images, some sort of purpose in these stories. But it made me think about the sort of love that exists on top of spaces that are filled with war, filled with pain, filled with loss. And it made me sort of start to think about the hybridization and sort of multiculturalism that exists between pre-Columbian and post-Columbian life. And it made me start to think about the subtle poetry that existed within that life. And I think most of my life, it's all been subtle. I've always had to search for the meaning. I've always had to find meaning in everything. And I think I do that constantly in my work because I'm still trying to find purpose. I'm still trying to find some sort of reconciliation within the chaos that makes up my family. And so we move from that work to this work. And like I said, you see these things sort of spring into life further. So on the left is the actual necklace that's given to me when I was born. It's one of the only things that I have from my father. So I have a few paños, a few drawings on paper that were given to me that survived up until present day. Most of everything else has been lost throughout movement, throughout, just moving from space to space, weathering storms. But I still have my necklace and I still wear it. And when I wear it, again, it's one of those things where it's not necessarily the icon itself that I'm interested in, it's the power that it makes me feel. It makes me feel close to my dad. So here you see it draped over the neck of the monument, the neck of the silhouette. And it hangs there right above this rose image, La Rosa, talking about these roses and what brings these sort of moments of beauty into these spaces filled with loss. This made me think about Gloria Anzaldua's chapter 7 of La Frontera. She talks about roses being Mexicans' favorite flower. And this is because the flower represents duality of life. Something that is both beautiful, tender, and tantalizing, but holds thorns and so is protective, guarded, and painful. Gloria said that this is Mexicans' favorite flower because it's representative of Texas. It's representative of the several translations and transformations that have occurred within that space. And so not very many people know this, but specifically South Texas, where I come from, it was first indigenous, then it became Spanish. From Spanish, it became Mexican. From Mexican, it became a republic. And from republic, it became America, or part of America, or the United States. And so it's seen a lot of transformation. And it's seen a lot of cultural transformation, a lot of heritage transformation, and translation also within that space. And so that's something I'm also sort of talking about in terms of my family history. So you see these sort of moments of loss and these moments of war, or these reflections of loss and these reflections of war, yet you see these roses and these bright colors that exist in the work. And again, this became representative of Texas. Roses still cover the land. Even in the projects, there are roses that fill the streets and are entangled within the chain links. And it's a really beautiful scene. And you start to realize that despite the harsh environment, these flowers are really resilient. Every spring they come back, they blossom. Every time they blossom, they bring back this migration of butterflies. And so this sort of cyclical life continues and repeats throughout the work. And so here you see, these butterflies returning to the space. You see, the necklace being wrapped around the monument, as I said. And you see these monarchs that are sort of dancing around this sort of metaphorical garden, communicating their sort of love for each other through silence. The last two images I want to show before we move on to the next chapter are these two. The left is titled, "On Earth I'm Never Seen, But I Feel You Within Me." And on the right image is, "In Heaven You'll Always Be Floating Over Me." All the work in this series actually creates a larger poem. And so all the work can be read as a poem. So every piece actually connects to the next piece, not only through its imagery, but through its language. And so the work also kind of communicates these notions as well. And so on the left, you actually see a Toltec symbol for Earth. And on the right, you see a Nike swoosh, which is a contemporary symbol that I connect to Earth. What I wear on my feet. What sort of grounds me in many ways. What sort of bounds me to this reality. What bounds me to Earth. And so you see sort of these subtle transformations from the past to the present. And again, you see this sort of growth. And so both terracotta sculptures hold these jade plants that were given to me by my mother before she moved to Washington. And I started taking care of these plants, and I realized as I was watering them and I was nurturing them, that I was also sort of nurturing these memories of my mom and nurturing these memories of my father. And so it became this sort of constant reminder that these things aren't things that just disappear. These are things that take time. And they take this sort of constant relationship, and they take this sort of constant nurturing. You also see these things placed on top of these street fragments that you'll also sort of see continue into the work. So we're going to move from Earth into chapter 3, which is about air. So this chapter is about air and trying to find balance between worlds. I call this series Collision. This series is sort of inspired and sort of stems from my return to SA back in 2021. So I didn't return back to San Antonio until 2021. It was the third time I met my dad in person. It took me 17 years to go back. And this is because, just the amount of money it takes to go back, having the stability to go back, having the time to go back. And so it takes me 17 years to come back to the place that I'm born. And when I come back in many ways, I come across the reality that the Wheatley courts that I knew of doesn't exist anymore. The Wheatley courts were actually demolished in 2014. between 2014 and 2016. And what sort of lies in the place that I was born is a new public housing project. And they actually changed the name too from the Wheatley Courts projects to East Meadows. And so when I went back to this space, I told my dad, take me back to the courts. I want to go back to these memories. And my dad goes, Mijo, this space doesn't exist anymore. I can take you back, but what you know of the courts doesn't exist anymore. So I returned back to this space, and he was right. Everything completely changed. Everything was erased. Like I said, the name had changed. The complex had changed. The space itself had changed. But what remained the same, actually, was the power lines that existed in the space and the shoes that were entangled within those power lines. In addition to returning back, I'm given another gift from my father. It's the first pair of Jordan 1s that I ever received. And so it's a shoe that I had it was the dream shoe all my life. I had hand-me-downs all my life, so I never had anything new. I had big pants that came from my brothers, big shoes that didn't fit me. But when I returned, my dad said, I have a gift for you. I'd like to give it to you when you get to my place. Get to the place, gives me a box, and it's a pair of black Jordan 1s. And so it's this gift he gave me as a return to coming back and visiting him, not forgetting the space that I sort of was born in. And it started to make me think about these roads that we travel in life, the roads that both take us to our future, but also the roads that we travel in order to move back to the past. And it started to make me think about the sacrifices that were made in order for me to have the current, career that I have. Because in many ways, I wouldn't be here without my mom's sacrifice of leaving the courts when I was a kid. My mom, still to this day, as well as my dad still to this day, tells me that if we wouldn't have left the courts, I would have either ended in prison with him, either in a gang, or I would have been dead by 18. And so for them, it's just a miracle that I'm alive. It's just, for them, it's just having me be able to be here and be present to them is just a miracle in and of itself. And so it started to talk about, again, the roads that I travel and the memories that sort of reoccur as you're sort of navigating these spaces back into the past. This piece is titled Vámonos Mestizo, Aslan Awaits. And this piece translates to, let's go, half-blood, Aslan awaits. Aslan is sort of the mythical home of the Mexica. And so it sort of represents home. And so for those that don't know the history related to the Mexica, Mexica actually came from a northern space before they landed in present-day Mexico City. And it's said that this space makes up the south and southwestern regions of the United States. So all of South Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, even parts of Utah, Colorado, and Southern California are said to be the homeland of these indigenous individuals, these individuals that are part of my heritage. And so coming back from Missouri to Texas, it was sort of this metaphor that I was going back home. I was returning back to this space that's filled with all these memories. And so within this piece, you see bandanas, you see rubber, you see horsehair, you see 10 milagros or miracles. You see rosary beads, rope, silver chain, diamond-plated steel, chrome tassels, and concrete, all draped around a horseshoe. And these also became representative of the cattle culture, the vaquero and ranchero culture of South Texas, specifically attached to San Antonio. And all this work is also made up of black, silver, and white. And those are the traditional colors that are attached to San Antonio. You see it within the San Antonio Spurs in terms of sports culture. You also see it within gang culture and street culture. And so these cultures are things that I'm sort of discussing within this work. You see these things again become prominent within this piece here called Skin and Chrome, which serves as an ofrenda or an altar, one worship, but one that doesn't always welcome everyone. A sentiment that's furthered by the glass shards that sit below and the anti-roosting devices that sort of rise above. These things sort of speak about trying to find peace, trying to find rest, trying to find balance, but failing to over and over again. At the bottom of the shelf, you see another piece that's titled Still Here, repeating again. And this is made up of glass shards that have images etched into them. Images of individuals found within protest of the south and southwestern regions of the United States, as well as individuals crossing the border. And so these images sort of become reflective of those spaces. And these images are also accompanied by hundreds of tin milagros that I gave out during my exhibition. Everybody was allowed to sort of take a few home with them. And this is because I started collecting them over the years, and I ended up having thousands of them in my studio. So I kind of wanted to give them out because I realized I was collecting them because I was trying to gather as much good luck as I could. But I was realizing that I needed to kind of give that out too, that it didn't necessarily serve the purpose that it needed to anymore. And so they became keepsakes and takeaways within the show. In the middle of this piece, you have deconstructed Jordan 1s that are laid flat over a panel, stretched over a panel. So I'm cutting and deconstructing these Jordan 1 shoes. I'm reconstructing them in a new image, and I'm stretching them around panels. And this piece gets inserted into the heart of the altar. And it becomes the only sort of soft moment amongst everything that's hardened and everything that is sort of like, at times, harmful. Again, you have glass shards, you have these anti-roosting, even these sort of diamond-plated steel roses are very sharp. And so the work itself becomes very fragile. You have to really know how to maneuver and navigate it in order to not get cut or to not get harmed by it. But again, there's that sort of soft moment in the heart of the piece, and this is the only part that you could sort of rest your head on. It's the only piece that you could sort of find some sort of rest in. These ideas of old histories colliding with new histories started taking me to these chamales. Chamales, for those that don't know, are Mexica shields. So, and when I say Mexica, we typically in the West refer to Mexica as Aztecs. But Aztecs didn't call themselves Aztecs, they called themselves Mexica. The reason why the Spanish called them Aztecs, or where this name kind of derives from, is because they come from Aztlan. And so this is sort of a reference to their home. And so Mexica had these shields, and it started making me think about the duality that existed within these shields. These shields are both things that are used to protect, but they're also weapons. And so there's this duality that exists within the images and duality that exists within the objects themselves. And this made me also think about the border and how in the North we see that specifically in the West as a border that serves as a symbol of protection, something that's protecting us from these unknowns, protecting us from these fears that we have and perpetuate within society. But getting older and being able to go back to Mexico and revisit that history, I realized that immediately as I crossed that border, that shield became a weapon. And so it realized in many ways that there is this duality that existed in this life, and that both these things are sort of getting pressed together at times. It also started to make me think about post-conquest and how the Spanish destroyed a majority of these chamales. So these chamales, there used to be thousands of them, but when the Spanish arrived, they burnt them all. They burnt them as a way of destroying the history of the indigenous people. Only 3 of them have survived up until the present. One of them is currently in Mexico City. One of them is in Northern Europe, in Austria, and the other one is in Southern Europe in Spain. And so these are things that have existed, are very rare, and these are things that Mexico has also asked to kind of come back to the space, but have been refused by these nations. And so it made me want to rediscover this history. I was like, I need to make these things myself, but I need to make them in reflection of this warfare, make them reflective of both the past and the present. And so you see these deconstructed Jordan 1s also occur, these triple white Jordan 1s that are cutting up and dissecting. And these things get attached to leather. That leather is attached to wood. You also below, you see turkey feathers. Up above, you see saddle rooster feathers. And you see faux rabbit fur. And so you see these things that are also kind of connected to both pre-Columbian life and post-Columbian life, in addition to, again, Guadalupe, that becomes a mirror milagro. It's actually the rarest milagro that I had because typically they're stamped individually. This one actually gets stamped double. And so it's a sort of a mirroring image of the thing. The title of this piece is called All Soul, No Rest. And again, it's a kind of contemporary chamale. Would you like me to stop? Yeah? Okay, I'll stop. Yeah. But that's just a sort of an install photo of the work. But I tried 47 minutes, man.
I I told you multiple times 45 minutes.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
Clapping for me,
Ah.
obviously. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As I warned you in the introduction, there may not be a question and answers, and that is not going to happen. But I do promise you, Andrew would love to talk to you about his work. Please go visit it in the McCaffrey Gallery across the hall, and then join us for a reception after. Thank you.